In the opening months of the war, British planners prepared a weapon that needed no pilots, no bombs, and no battleships. Once released, it would drift silently with the current, carrying destruction deep into enemy territory. Then, just before it was unleashed, everything stopped. By September 1939, Europe was already sliding into catastrophe. Germany had invaded Poland. Britain and France were now at war with the Third Reich, but on the Western Front, almost nothing seemed to happen. This period, later known as the Phony War, stretched from late 1939 into early 1940. Armies mobilized, navies patrolled, civilians waited, and behind closed doors, both sides searched desperately for ways to break the stalemate without triggering total escalation. Britain faced a dangerous dilemma. The country was not yet ready for a full-scale land war on the continent. The British Expeditionary Force was still mobilizing. Air power was limited. Strategic bombing was controversial and politically risky. Any overt attack on German cities could provoke immediate retaliation against British civilians. But doing nothing was equally dangerous. So British planners began looking for indirect ways to hurt Germany's war economy, methods that could be denied, delayed, or disguised if necessary. By October 1939, attention turned to something Germany depended on every day but could not easily protect. Its rivers. Germany's internal transport system relied heavily on rivers like the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube. Coal, iron ore, fuel, and industrial goods moved constantly along these waterways. Barges were the arteries of the Reich's economy. Disrupt them and factories would slow, power plants would falter, war production would suffer. And crucially, this could be done without bombing cities. The idea that emerged was chillingly simple. Instead of attacking ships directly, Britain would weaponize the rivers themselves. The plan originated within the British Ministry of Economic Warfare, with technical input from naval intelligence and explosives experts. By November 1939, it had taken a formal shape and received a codename: Operation Royal Marine. The concept was to deploy thousands of small floating mines into rivers that flowed from neutral or Allied-controlled territory into Germany. Once released upstream, the devices would drift naturally with the current, carried deep into the German heartland. There would be no aircraft overhead, no ships approaching German ports. Just the river doing what it had always done. Each mine was designed to look as inconspicuous as possible. Some resembled pieces of debris. Others were shaped to minimize visibility from shore. They would detonate when striking barges, locks, bridges, or riverbanks. The effect would be unpredictable and constant. A barge captain would never know if the next bend in the river carried death. Engineers repairing one explosion might trigger another. Traffic would slow to a crawl or stop entirely. By December 1939, the plan had advanced beyond theory. British factories began producing the mines. Storage sites were prepared. Deployment teams were trained. The Royal Navy and special units coordinated release points along rivers feeding into German-controlled waterways. The initial target was the Rhine. From French territory and potentially from neutral borders, mines could be introduced into tributaries that flowed directly into Germany. Once in the Rhine system, they would spread across hundreds of miles of inland shipping routes. By January 1940, Operation Royal Marine was nearly ready. But as preparations intensified, so did the doubts. The first concern was escalation. Mining rivers was not a traditional act of war. Unlike bombing a military target, it could not be easily controlled or limited. Mines might drift into neutral territory. Civilian casualties were almost guaranteed, and Germany could respond in kind. British planners feared retaliation against their own rivers, ports, and canals. The second concern was legality. International law surrounding river warfare was murky, especially when neutral states were involved. Several of the rivers feeding Germany passed through or bordered countries not yet at war. Violating their waterways could draw them into the conflict or push them toward Germany. By February 1940, diplomatic pressure was mounting quietly behind the scenes. France, Britain's key ally on the continent, was particularly uneasy. French leaders worried that mining rivers could provoke German reprisals against French infrastructure or accelerate a wider conflict they were not prepared to fight. At the same time, the strategic picture was changing. The phony war was ending. German troop movements suggested something big was coming. By March 1940, British intelligence believed an attack in the west was imminent. attention shifted from economic disruption to immediate military survival. Still, Operation Royal Marine was not cancelled outright. In early April 1940, final deployment plans were drawn up, mines were positioned, orders were drafted. The release was scheduled in phases, beginning with limited tests before full-scale deployment. Then, in early May 1940, Germany struck. On May 10, 1940, German forces invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The Western Front exploded into motion. Within weeks, the carefully prepared British and French defences collapsed. The context that had made Operation Royal Marine appealing no longer existed. Britain was no longer trying to apply quiet pressure from a distance. It was fighting for survival. Resources, attention, and political capital shifted instantly. On May 14, 1940, with German troops advancing rapidly and Allied forces in retreat, Operation Royal Marine was suspended. By late May, as British forces evacuated from Dunkirk, the operation was effectively dead. The mines were never released. Some were dismantled, others remained in storage, eventually scrapped as the war moved into a new phase dominated by air battles and large-scale bombing. Operation Royal Marine disappeared almost completely from public memory. Yet its implications linger. Had the plan gone forward in early 1940, Germany's inland transport system could have been thrown into chaos at a critical moment. Coal shortages might have worsened. Industrial bottlenecks could have slowed early war production. But the risks were enormous. Neutral countries might have been dragged into the war months earlier. German retaliation could have targeted British rivers and ports long before air defences were ready. Civilian casualties on both sides would have been unavoidable. Most unsettling of all is how quietly it came to the edge of execution. No dramatic cancellation, no public debate, just a plan that existed in the narrow window between hesitation and catastrophe. World War II is often remembered through massive battles and famous commanders, but beneath that surface were operations like Royal Marine, ideas born in desperation, prepared in secrecy, and abandoned when history shifted direction. In early 1940, Britain stood on the brink of unleashing a weapon that would turn rivers into invisible front lines. The current was ready. The mines were built. And then the war moved too fast. Sometimes history is shaped not by what was done, but by what was stopped just moments before it began.